exercise intensities for paddlers and how paddlers can use exercise science to get the right intensities to improve your racing performance. So what we've got here is an explanation of the zone model, so zone 1 to 5 and also zone 6 and 7. That model simplified in terms of exercise, how exercise physiologists view the zone model and some ways to train those different zones for paddling performance. So more on that in a second, but first let's go through some of that terminology that we use in training, like thresholds. How often have you heard the word threshold? But are you in the right threshold? Because there is actually two of those. So as we move through the zones 1 to 5, there are actually two different thresholds that we need to refer to or understand to get our training right. The first one is aerobic threshold. So that is the point where lactate goes above 1 millimole in our blood, and we will draw a line on a graph to demark that point, and that is our zone 2 maximum. So as we start to increase that intensity, we will get to another point in our blood lactate where it starts to exponentially increase. So this is called your anaerobic threshold. If you were to measure power at this point, cyclists refer to this as your functional threshold power. Above that, we start to get into VO2, and above VO2, we start to get into those supramaximal intensities, which is more about strength and power and how much absolute force you can produce without getting into the aerobic metabolism processes. So as an exercise scientist, we typically use those two thresholds to demark or to identify three specific zones. So we take our 7-zone model or our 5-zone model, and we turn that into a 3-zone model just to simplify things. So the first one, or zone 1 and 2 in the 5-zone model, or below aerobic threshold, is just low intensity. So we'll typically work closer to aerobic threshold than we would a super low intensity. So we wouldn't program really low intensities, we would program steady aerobic work. And we also use the talk test here as a practical way to understand if you are at the right intensity. If you can talk like I am now, you're possibly working too easy. And if you can only say a few words, 3 or 4 words, have to take a breath and then say another 3 or 4 words, you are most likely, and the research backs this up, at your aerobic threshold. And you may have heard the term MAF to identify this by going 180 minus your age to give you a heart rate. So if you are going to use heart rate, using a low intensity heart rate is probably a more accurate heart rate to use rather than high intensity heart rates. And let me explain that a little bit later. Moving between your aerobic and anaerobic thresholds, and even towards VO2 max, we start to get into race specific intensities. So this really depends on what our goal is, what our sport is. So are you a K1 paddler? Are you a surf ski paddler? Are you a marathon paddler? What pace do you need to achieve over what period of time to achieve your goal? So if we're a K1 paddler and we want to hit 18 Ks an hour for 4 minutes, yet our top pace is only 19, we're going to have to do a little bit more training up here to improve our maximum velocity to allow us room to be able to hit that pace at a lower intensity. If we're a more endurance paddler, like a surf ski paddler or a marathon paddler, we want to help identify that aerobic threshold pace, because this is where we're going to sit for an hour, hour and a half, under 2-hour races, depending on how fit you are. And it's also the pace that you start to slow down to in like a K1 1000 meter race. So what's really important here is in our training, we identify those paces that equal a successful result in those races. And we try and achieve that pace at a lower intensity so we know we can do it in the race. And it's not all about physiology. So we can achieve a higher pace for a lower input, so increased efficiency through better technique, more efficient technique, or more skills on the water, so such as downwind paddling, chasing the runs, linking the runs, having more rest, but achieving a high speed. which means we can spend more time down here rather than up here. Interestingly, when we talk about zones, we go from a low intensity to a high intensity. And when we talk about energy systems, we generally talk about that from a high intensity to a low intensity. So what's really important to realize with aerobic metabolism is it has a metabolic lag. So it takes time for those biochemical processes to work through from the lungs into the blood to the muscle to produce energy, whereas anaerobic systems can work a lot quicker. So that has implications for training VO2 max or your anaerobic threshold. To train VO2 max, so we therefore need to make sure that we are increasing our intensity in the training session. So we're not going out too hard and then falling back to a lower intensity. We're starting at a lower intensity and working to a higher intensity. So a VO2 max session might look like 4 by 4 minutes. But before that, we're going to do a really sufficient warm-up, spending a little bit of time in the lower zones, and then doing some race specific, or in this case, interval specific pacing. So the pace that we want to achieve in our intervals before we do the first interval. So that's going to prime our aerobic system through the levels to make sure that our metabolic lag or our aerobic metabolism is already working sufficiently. So when we get to that first effort, it doesn't take us as long to get aerobic metabolism producing the large proportion of the energy required to achieve the output that we want. So that's represented by these angled lines here. We want to start a little bit easy and then max towards the end. Because if you've ever done a VO2 max test, you'll know that you step through various intensities, and it's the same way that we identify your thresholds. You step through the intensities, so by the time you get to the last step or the last block of that test, you are at VO2 max because you've stepped through the intensity. So we need to try and simulate that to achieve a VO2 max session. The mistake I see a lot in training is people say they're doing a VO2 session, but they're really doing a threshold session. So a threshold session would be more like your 8 times 4 minutes or 10 times 4 minutes. Got less rest. So in a VO2 session, we would have at least the same amount of rest that we did in our effort. In a threshold session, we would have a lot less rest. So it might be 2 to 1, whereas a VO2 session might be 1 to 1. So slightly lower intensity. So really important as well that we move through the levels. So we don't go out too hard. If we do the first one too hard, then our output's going to decrease. But if we start off within a lower intensities and work towards that threshold pace, then we've got more chance of spending more time at threshold, therefore improving our efficiencies at that threshold pace. And more importantly, learning how that threshold pace feels. So when we come to race day, we can feel that pace. And that's really important when it comes to training, because feeling the pace that you're at has been shown to be more accurate than heart rate data alone. The issue with heart rate data with paddlers is a lot of that data that we use in the science and the research is based off cycling and running. Go to PubMed now and look up paddling, kayaking, canoeing, sports science papers on exercise intensities. You'll find a lot more on cycling and running than you will for paddling. So the research is fairly limited in how that bulk of the research applies to paddling. So that means it's really important to feel where you are in your intensity rather than rely on heart rate data alone. Heart rate data is useful, especially in retrospect. And remember, things that can affect heart rate data might be hydration, stress, training status, amount of sleep, etc. So there is some variation if you're using hard zones. Having a feeling to those zones just gives us a bit more context and helps us understand if we're in a state of overtraining or perhaps we need to alter the session for the day. For surski paddlers, the old 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off is a really good session. And that's also going to help us get into some VO2. Why is that? Because 30 seconds on is going to be really hard. So it's actually going to be above VO2 max in terms of output. We're not going to be able to sustain that for up to 2 to 4 minutes. But we're going to come back down into the lower intensities for that 30-second off. And then we're going to go back up again, and then back down again, and then back up again. So what that does is create a cardiac drift. So it means we don't have enough time to recover between efforts. So eventually our aerobic system is going to start producing the energy to achieve the output. And our anaerobic system is going to start to become tired. The aerobic system is not replenishing or have enough time to replenish that enough. So our heart rate ends up drifting towards maximum, and we spend some time at VO2 max. And that's really important if we talk about downwind paddling, because we're sprinting for waves, and then we're resting, and then we're sprinting for waves. So that's quite a good specific session for surf ski paddlers. And also a good session to use for flat water paddlers is sometimes the monotonous 4 minutes on, 4 times 4 minutes can get boring. So it provides good variation to achieve the same physiological result. So it can get really complex really quickly. I know that was a lot. Feel free to reach out. Check out my website, strongpaddler.com, where I've got training programs built for you using this philosophy of descriptive intensities. So you can spend more time at the intensity you need to race at to achieve your best results. Cheers.